and welcome to an episode of The Focal Thought. And my guest today is Aysha Akhtar. How are you, Dr. Akhtar?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Corden?
Good, good. Thanks so much for coming on the show. I'm really excited to speak with you today. And just for our listeners, just to introduce you to them, you're basically a double board certified neurologist and preventative medicine slash public health specialist. And you're also the president and CEO of the Center for Contemporary Sciences. And you are a US veteran, so thank you for your service there. And you've been, I think, as a medical officer at the Food and Drug Administration and recently at the Office of Counterterrorism and Emerging Threats. You're also an author of two books, which is our Symphony with Animals on health, empathy, and our shared destinies, as well as animals and public health. And you've got a TED Talk out, right, as well?
It's a TEDx talk, yes.
TEDx Talk, yes. So that's great. I'm really excited, as I said, to speak with you. And just sort of a context, I heard you speak with Ocean Robbins recently on an interview. And it really struck me that, you're a scientist and you were speaking, about compassion for animals. And, the first thing that took to me was usually when scientists work with animals, it's for sort of, the realm of science, and they don't have, too much compassion for animals. So, if you can just let us know, first off, where did this compassion come from? Was there a turning point? Were you always like this? If you can give us some background to that, please.
Sure. I've always, from the moment I first became best friends with my grandparents' dog, Sylvester, I've loved animals. I sought animals out. I've just had this natural tendency to seek out animals as a child. And then my parents and my family, we started getting cats when I was in, you might hear one of them crying in the background every now and then, and I apologize for that.
No,
That's messy. So we got cats when I was in high school, and we just absolutely fell in love with our cats. And one day we started getting literature about what happens to cows on factory farming. It was something we had never ever thought about. We ate animals at the time. We never thought about animals, and it just struck us really that there's really no difference between cows and our cats. And so that really led us as a family, and then me individually, on a real journey to really understand how we relate with animals across many different categories, and how that impacts us, and what does empathy for animals mean. So I started reading everything out there about animal ethics, and including the science of it all. And I've just been a real proponent for animal protection since high school.
got it. Okay. So then when you were getting into science, you were conscious, in terms of compassion about animals, right? As you were in the field.
Once this transformation happened when I was in high school, yes. Before that, I didn't. I didn't really think about it. Although I'm sure once I got into college, and I'm hoping at least that once the idea of hurting animals in biology classes was presented to me, I'd like to think that I would have refused. But for either way, my compassion was awakened before I really burgeoned into my scientific career. So yes, I went into it with that compassion already in mind.
Got it. Okay. And with animal compassion, with very recently, there are movements such as PETA, where they're advocating for not eating animal flesh, and then there's yourself in the field of science who's advocating for not using animals, for research and experiments, things like that. And then those are sort of contemporary movements. And if we go, further back, if we look at, religion, there are some, religious organizations, like the Jains, who, they're very passionate and, compassionate about animals' welfare as well. So we're seeing sort of, two drastic timelines here, one from, the very recent to one to recent. From what you've studied and learned, how is that evolving? Like, how far have we come as a species towards, how we look at animals in terms of compassion?
I think so. So I think the modern effort to really look at compassion for animals has been stemmed in part, it's a reaction to how much we abuse animals worldwide. I mean, we are they are the most abused creatures, in the world, and the numbers are staggering. In the tens of millions at least every year. So I think that the new tendency to really shift focus to how we treat other animals is in part a response to this recognition of, God, we are hurting animals at a rate and a scale that we've never done before, ever. And that's in large part because of our industries, our everyday practices, when we think about food, when we think about animals used for experimentation, when we think about animals used for fur and for leather, and then entertainment and the wildlife trade, and just so many aspects. I mean, the exploitation of animals has just seeded so much of what we do today, whether as individuals or collectively as society. And so I think that's in part why there's such a difference now. It's not just I as an individual don't want to, hurt an animal in my life. The statement or the narrative is becoming more of, we as a civilized people, we as a society should strive to minimize suffering to animals as much as possible. And so I think that's where the shift is really changing and really taking place.
Got it. Okay, so it's with individuals, right, who are sort of taking on a stance.
It's a more of a, we as collectively, as society, we need to start making these changes. That is not just an individual thing. It's not just an individual choice in a sense, but that it's a societal mandate. It's an ethical imperative for us as human beings, as we like to think we're civilized societies. I think that's where we need to shift the dialogue.
Sure. And I mean individuals as in a starting point. It should start with individuals, and then that grows into, communities, which grows into societies, right?
Oh yeah, always. It always starts with individuals, doesn't it? It's just with every type of movement you think of, every type of real change in how we think about how we treat others, it always does start with individuals.
What do you see as maybe, in your movement currently, some of the roadblocks with the starting point being individuals? There are some that are very active. Some are doing it because, of organizations like PETA, where they see that, they understand it. And then recently, with I think it was SeaWorld, if I'm not mistaken,
Mm-hmm.
the treatment of animals there, there's been, some sort of movement there. What do you see as a roadblock to maybe, making this go faster?
Right. The scale of the suffering that occurs to animals is on such a large, I'm saying scale again, I can't think of a better word, but it is so large that individual efforts is not enough. We have to work towards structural changes, policy and structural changes. We need to change the way our companies practice, our governmental agency practice, and how we fund things. So if you think about like what we're trying to do in my organization, the Center for Contemporary Sciences, we know that it's not going to take one-on-one hoping that one scientist will say, oh, I'm not going to use animals anymore, I'm going to use something else. That's not going to work. That's not really where the best and the most lasting and the fastest change is going to happen. It's got to work at the structural level, at the systemic level. So what we're trying to do is really work on policy changes, work on large scale educational changes, driving investment into testing methods that are based on human biology, which can be far better than animal testing. So this makes it a win-win for humans and animals. And changing governmental funding paradigms, and all kinds of processes like that work at the larger systemic level.
Got it. Okay, so we're trying to influence individuals who are in, just regular day-to-day, 9 to 5 lives, as well as influencing individuals a policy making capacity, in a structural sort of capacity, right? In government organizations, etc., things like that.
Yeah, that's the only way you're really going to make some real dramatic changes. And so, if you wait for each person to make a change on their own, that's just going to take forever.
Yeah,
And it may not last. I mean, someone can change, and let's say you're talking about someone who adopts a vegan diet, they may become vegan one day, and as we know, so many of them then say, "I'm no longer vegan," 2 years down the road. If you really want to have lasting change, you have to get back to the root cause, the structures that can influence change, the structures that allow the suffering of animals to occur, and then try to untease those structures and create a new structure that's kinder.
got it. Yeah, and there are those people who listen to authority more than themselves, right, in life sometimes.
Yeah, I know.
I'd read a stat that I think it was in the US alone, about 25 million animals are killed on a daily basis. And if you look at it worldwide, it's about, I think 150 to 200 million animals. And that's on a daily basis. Is that something that's true? That stat? Does that resonate?
Is that I'm not sure if those are you're talking about all animals across all different areas, or is that for
So
experimentation?
for what I remember, it was just number of animals killed in the US was 25 million, and worldwide was, I think, close to 200 million.
I honestly I can't comment on that. What I can say is that in the United States, for if we just look at experimentation, we're looking at well beyond 100 million per year, and that's for experimentation. If you
Wow.
think about all the other uses of animals and farmed animals and other places, and yeah, you've greatly increased that number, but I don't know what that would be.
Got it. Okay. And that's something interesting as well that you had mentioned on that podcast, is that science is currently used to using animals for research and experimentation. And now we don't have to rely on that as much because with things like 3D bioprinting, etc., we can use those facilities. But what really struck me was you said that a lot of the research that is done, with animal testing doesn't really apply nor is effective to humans, right? Like when it's
That's correct.
actually practiced.
That's correct. Yeah. And there's, if you just look at one statistic, which is that 90 to 95% of the drugs and vaccines that pass animal tests, they are found to be safe and effective in animals, end up failing when trying in humans. So what that, and most of them end up failing because they're ineffective or unsafe in humans. And what that suggests is that animal tests, though not the only cause, but it is one of the main contributors to this high failure rate in drug development. So, and when you think about it, it just makes sense. There maybe 100 years ago, at the level that we're studying biology, what you saw in a rat could be applicable to what you see in a human. But we've gone well beyond that stage. We're looking at subtle nuances of molecular biology and genetics and genetic expression. And at this level, even minor differences between species can have profound impacts and can really lead to very problematic translation from animal to human. That it just becomes very hard to use other species to predict what we're going to see in humans. So there's a really compelling evidence that's really building, that is showing more and more that whatever their role might have been in the past, today, the question we have to ask is animal testing the best way to get the answers we need today? And the evidence is really showing no, and that we need to get back to studying human biology. And so these techniques that, like at the Center for Contemporary Science, that we really are excited about are things like organs on a chip, 3D printing of human organs in the lab, computational analysis that actually is what's often called big data here, where they're looking at the going through all the human data that's already out there that's been gathered from clinical trials. I mean, we have so much human data that we still haven't really tapped into their use. Already existing human data that can tell us about how drugs may cause toxic effects, and what other drug may cause a toxic effect based on its similarity to a past drug and things like that. So there's a wealth of information, wealth of techniques that have been out there for a while, but new techniques that are gaining even more momentum because they're even better than what they were. And it's these techniques, or techniques like this, that are really going to transform biomedical science. It's going to be what ultimately will get animals out of the lab and what ultimately will improve human health. It truly is a benefit for humans and animals.
Yes. And why is it that there's a difference that, the research doesn't transfer over from animals to humans? Is it mainly to do with the biology, or is it something as specific as the DNA or the genome structure? Or...
Oh, it's a combination of everything. It's not as much of the genome structure, but the function and the expression of our DNA. So, we share a lot of the DNA, most of our DNA, with other mammals. So the structure, at least as far as we can tell, is very similar, but that's not where the problems lie in that sense. It's the expression of our genes that changes. That can be incredibly different between two different species, and just all other things like that. There's just so many nuances in our biology. We don't even know what they all are. And that's the other thing, is that there are so many differences. We don't even know what all the differences are. So in a sense, when we use an animal, we're blindly hoping that what we find in the animal is going to be predictive of what we find in humans. But that's not really the way we need to proceed for medical science. We need to do better than that.
And then if it's not translating it over, why are we still doing that then?
Yeah, it's like so many practices that are just so entrenched. It's difficult. A lot of people have built their careers on this. A lot of scientists know how to use animals and don't know how to use these other techniques. So they're comfortable with using animals, and that's what they know, and that's what they're going to continue using. Funding mechanisms still prioritize animal testing over the development of other types of testing methods. And again, it's part of this whole culture of habit, in a sense, within the biomedical sciences. You think science is supposed to be, open to new ideas, new approaches, but that's so not the case, unfortunately. That scientists are just like other human beings. Everyone has their own biases and their own ingrained practices that they use by default. So it takes a cultural change to move over into these other testing methods, but it's going to happen. It is building. The momentum, the call for human-based testing methods is building among scientific groups. And I predict that with each new generation of scientists that come out as well, we're going to see fewer of them having used animals and more of them using these other techniques. So it's animal testing will die off at some point in one way or another.
That's positive. And I'm glad you mentioned the word entrench, because that is, the reason. But it's not sustainable. And I too, tend to think that scientists, would be open-minded just by the very nature of the vocation. But like you're saying, not all scientists are open-minded. And again, depends on funding and politics and their beliefs and attitudes. And I was, listening to a conversation with Paul Chek and Ervin Laszlo the other day, who's a physical theorist. And they were saying, along the same lines, to, affect, change, you have to get it on a fundamental level. And, people in power, in governments and, religious institutions, things like that, in order to affect them on a fundamental level, it's almost that you have to get it to a deep-rooted belief level, which is, it can be something as basic as, their belief in God, right? And it all stems from that basic fundamental belief that you get these, changes and effects happening.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the scientific inertia that I mentioned isn't just in the biomedical sciences. I think you'll find that there's ingrained practices and cultures and lack of desire to be really open-minded across many scientific disciplines. And, again, I think when people hear that, they never really believe it because they think science by default means people are open-minded. But, everyone in the sciences, is a human being. So
Yeah.
we bring all our human baggage, and every human being has his or her own biases going into everything. So it as much as the idea of science can be so clean and objective, the problem is that the practice of science is not so, because it is practiced by humans.
Got it. Got it. And then what are your thoughts on human testing? I mean, I would tongue in cheek say, it'd be ideal to test on humans because we're applying to humans, but that's not ethical. That's not right. But for people that do focus groups or light pharmaceutical testing, where you go in for 2 hours and they pay you an honorary stipend. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we need clinical trials. We will always need clinical trials, and that's when you have people enroll in studies, because that's the gold standard. If the gold standard of human biology is human biology, so we need people always to be in part of these clinical trials. That's never going to go. The thing is that they are at greater risk when people enroll in clinical trials because of based on data that's misleading. So when people enroll in clinical trials, they assume, and it's kind of the story that's given, is that they're going to be safe, more likely to be safe because animal testing has been done, when that's not really the case. Animal testing is very unpredictable of human biology. So actually, the reliance on animal testing puts people in clinical trials at greater risk for safety problems. So if we really want to protect people who are enrolled in clinical trials, we need to have better methods before a drug ever gets into the clinical trial phase. We need to have methods that are really going to help us understand how a drug or vaccine is going to work in humans. And that, again, goes back to we need methods based on human biology. So these are methods that are, just wonderful. They're methods that could one day lead to clinical trials in the lab, clinical trials on a chip technology, because you can capture biological samples, tissues from a wide variety of people. So you can look at the heterogeneity across the human population before you even get to trying it in humans. So you can there's so much potential with what can be done with these new technologies.
Got it. So you need a larger sample size just to be better sure, right, before engaging.
It's one potential avenue is to be able to do large sample size clinical trials, in a sense, on a lab chip. And I think that's where the future of biomedicine is going to be. And the reason why that's going to be is because we can do these things. We can really get back to studying human biology. But we'll always need clinical trials for most things, and that's the nature of things. But what we need to do is try to help ensure that people enrolled in clinical trials are going to have the safest medicines possible and aren't putting their lives at risk for medicines that may not work in them. And so if we want to ensure their safety as much as possible, we need the best tools to use before we get to clinical trials. And so that's not animal testing. It's methods based on human biology.
Sure. And there's a big difference between, a clinical trial for sleep apnea versus going, to test out for a vaccine, right? Like you're saying, risking your lives.
Right. And it obviously, for sleep apnea, there's a wide variety of types of clinical trials. So some are going to be more risky and some will be less so.
Got it. And what about if I could ask you your thoughts on plants? Because, when I speak to people sometimes, when they do the switch from not eating meat, one of the reasons, and again, it depends who you're speaking to, it could be ethical reasons, it could be religious reasons. Some people say, the animal has the suffering in their biomemory. I've spoken to some monks about this, and they say that that is stored in the flesh. So when you eat it, you actually absorb the suffering of the animal. So then I asked them, how comes it is that you eat plants? And then they say, well, plants don't have sort of that suffering in terms of memory. Their nervous system is different. But then some say, they don't even eat plants. They eat the fruits of the plants. So they're not even, hurting plants. What are your thoughts about compassion for plants?
I think that's kind of getting into in the sense of metaphysical realm, as far as the idea of suffering, um, being part, this memory of suffering. I can't comment on that. If someone wants to go vegan, wants
Yeah,
to go plant-based, you're going to be saving more plants. If you think that there's a reason to save more plants, then going vegan, actually you will save more plants, because we do know that it takes about 10 pounds of plant protein to make 1 pound of animal protein. So there's a very inefficient transfer rate there. So it's behooves us to save our planet, to save our natural resources, to save the land, to save the trees and the diversity of plants out there, to go more plant-based, because that uses less land, that uses less resources.
got it. That makes sense. So if you're going vegan, you're actually helping plants, even though you're eating plants in the long-term sustainable fashion.
Oh yeah, and not just in the long. I mean, yeah, definitely. You're definitely making a greater impact on plants, than you would otherwise if you had not gone vegan.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, people have said also, what you take from the earth, you actually take from yourself. So when you're cutting down, trees from, a rainforest, you're actually, cutting down a bit of yourself because, those trees were there to somehow, whether it's directly or indirectly, affect you and, affect your life, right? In terms of karma or positive or negative. So, with a movement that you're doing, this is not just going to affect people on one layer, on one level. It's going to affect people and life sustainably. And who knows how it can impact or, change the dynamic of the earth, right?
Yeah, every time we cut down a tree, we don't just cut down a tree. We remove a system basically that many beings depend on. And so there's an ecological system that is tied to that tree. So the less we do that, the better, the more sustainability, our actions will have. So yeah, there's never a one-off. It's never you do this one thing and it's only going to impact that one entity. Um, every action we take, or every action we decide not to take, has an impact, potential impact, that goes far beyond just the immediate individual.
Definitely. And as far as, because of your relationship with animals, both, with the cats you have at home and, with the research you've done, animals are very aware. They're very conscious. They're very emotional too, right? They can sense, we've heard of animals sensing, danger in advance and things like that. They must have, some sort of herd awareness as to, uncompassionate acts that are garnered towards the animal kingdom, right? Did you find that at all or see that or?
That's not really part of anything I've studied, so I wouldn't be able to comment on that, except that to say that animals, of course, they feel fear, and they can pick up when something is a threat to them very quickly. So there's no denying that animals feel a full range of emotional capacities.
Sure, and that goes both ways, and that's why we have relationships with the animals we have at home. And I remember someone saying once, the more I interact with people, the more I love my dog.
Yeah, I know. I think that was Mark Twain who initially said that.
No, that's great. I want to thank you for coming on the show and sharing some of your thoughts and what you've been up to. And what I'm really excited about is this is something that's not new in the sense like as I mentioned, we've seen age-old religions try to promote this, but that it is contemporary and it is gaining awareness. And that I really like that you're very positive about this, and you see a future that, we don't rely on, animal testing, which is great, for everyone sustainably. So thank you for sharing that message. And if people want to find out more about your work and what you do, and get a hold of the books you've written, where can they find you?
Thank you. So if you want to find out more about our organization, we're the Center for Contemporary Sciences, or www.contemporarysciences.org. And you can learn a little bit about me on the website, and of course, about the organization as a whole. And if you want to learn more about my book and other things, you can just Google me, my name, Aysha Akhtar, and I have a personal website with information about my books as well.
Okay, great. I'll be sure to put these up in the show notes as well.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And once again, thank you for coming on the show, and I wish you all the best in your career.
Thank you so much, Corydon.